Is Granny Eleanor, the respected chairman of the Harrison family empire, had been away for 3 months. During that time, she had thought deeply about her grandson Jake Harrison, who was set to take over as the head of the family's prestigious law firm. Jake, known for his intelligence and charm, was also famous for staying out of the public eye. Few people had seen his face, which made him a mystery even within the company. At the firm, the staff was buzzing with excitement. Whispers and giggles filled the air as the workers speculated about Jake's arrival. "He's so handsome, I heard," said one junior lawyer, her voice barely above a whisper. "And rich," added another, her eyes sparkling. "Can you imagine being the one to catch his attention? He's the most eligible bachelor around." Despite the excitement, no one had any idea that Jake would soon be among them in disguise. Meanwhile, Grandma Eleanor had her own plan. Instead of making a grand entrance as the chairman, she decided to go undercover as an old cleaner. She wanted to see how things worked in the company when no one knew her real identity. She also had a secret mission: to find a wife for Jake, someone who would love him for who he truly was, not his status or wealth. Dressed in plain clothes and wearing an old watch that looked like a cheap knockoff, Grandma Eleanor entered the law firm. Most people ignored her, but a group of female employees quickly took notice. "Who let her in?" One of them sneered, glaring at Grandma Eleanor. "She's wearing that fake watch, trying to look rich." Another added, rolling her eyes. They laughed and pointed at her, making rude comments loud enough for others to hear. Grandma Eleanor stayed quiet at first, observing them with sharp eyes. But when one of the women stepped closer and accused her of wanting to belong to the upper class, the situation escalated. "It's just an old watch," Grandma Eleanor said calmly. "Why does it matter to you?" Her response didn't sit well with them. One of the women shoved her slightly, and Grandma Eleanor stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance. Before things could get worse, a voice cut through the commotion. "Enough!" Sophie, a young, beautiful lawyer with sharp features, stepped forward. Her presence immediately silenced the room. "What are you doing?" Sophie asked the group firmly, crossing her arms. "She's just doing her job. Don't you have better things to do than bully someone?" The group of women exchanged awkward glances but didn't back down entirely. One of them sneered at Sophie, her tone dripping with mockery. "Look who's talking," she said. "Aren't you the one who got dumped for being too nosy? No wonder you're single." Sophie's jaw tightened, but she didn't falter. "I wasn't dumped," she replied coolly. "I left him. I don't want a cheating boyfriend, and I certainly don't tolerate liars. It's called self-respect. You should try it sometime." Her words stung, and the group of women muttered grudgingly among themselves. One by one, they walked away, clearly irritated but unwilling to continue the confrontation. Sophie turned to Grandma Eleanor, her expression softening. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Grandma Eleanor nodded, giving Sophie a small smile. "Thank you, dear. I appreciate it." "It's nothing," Sophie said with a shrug. "Just let me know if anyone bothers you again." As Sophie walked away, Grandma Eleanor's eyes followed her. A small, knowing smile played on her lips. "She's got a good heart," Grandma Eleanor murmured to herself. "This one's special." The office had quieted down after the earlier commotion, and Grandma Eleanor decided it was the perfect time to approach Sophie. She found her sitting at her desk, focused on a stack of papers. Clearing her throat softly, Grandma Eleanor spoke up. "Excuse me, dear, can I have a moment of your time?" Sophie looked up and smiled warmly, recognizing the older woman she had helped earlier. "Of course, ma'am. How can I help you?" Grandma Eleanor sat down across from Sophie, her sharp eyes glinting with curiosity. "I couldn't help but overhear your colleagues earlier," she began. "It seems you're single. Would you mind marrying my grandson?" Sophie blinked, surprised by the unexpected question. She laughed politely, not sure if Grandma Eleanor was serious. "That's very kind of you to suggest, but I'm not looking for love right now. I've had my fair share of heartbreak, and I think I'm better off focusing on my career." Grandma Eleanor tilted her head. "Heartbreak? You're much too young to have gone through so much pain." Sophie hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "A lot of men have let me down. My most recent boyfriend, who was also a colleague here, cheated on me. And not just anywhere. He did it right here in the office. I caught him red-handed." It was humiliating. Grandma Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her voice firm. "You're right to be cautious. But I can assure you, my grandson is nothing like that. He lost both his parents in a car accident when he was very young. I raised him myself, and he's grown up to be a fine young man with a kind heart. He would never betray someone like that." Sophie gave Grandma Eleanor a soft smile, not wanting to offend her. "That's very sweet of you to say. I'll think about it," she said jokingly, trying to brush off the seriousness of the conversation. Just then, the door to the office opened, and a young man walked in. Sophie's attention was immediately drawn to him. He had strikingly handsome features, sharp cheekbones, kind eyes, and a confident yet humble demeanor. He was dressed in simple clothes, yet he carried himself with an air of quiet elegance. "Grandma," the young man said, his voice warm and familiar as he approached. Grandma Eleanor smiled fondly. "Jake, there you are! Come here, dear." Sophie froze for a moment. Grandma? Was this the grandson she had just been asked to consider? "This is Jake," Grandma Eleanor said, introducing him with pride. "He's a new intern here at the firm." Jake smiled at Sophie, extending his hand. "Hi, I'm Jake. It's nice to meet you." Sophie shook his hand, her cheeks tinged with a slight blush. "I'm Sophie. Welcome to the firm." Jake's smile widened. "Thank you. I've heard this is a great place to learn, so I'm excited to get started." Grandma Eleanor watched the interaction with a satisfied smile, her mind already working with plans. As Sophie returned to her work, she couldn't help but steal glances at Jake, wondering how such a seemingly humble and polite young man could possibly be related to the woman who had just offered her an unusual proposal. Sophie tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to the unexpected conversation with Grandma Eleanor, and now to Jake. There was something about him that intrigued her. He wasn't arrogant or entitled, like some of the other men in the firm. Instead, he seemed different. As the day went on, Jake settled into his role as an intern. He was assigned to assist different departments, which gave him the perfect opportunity to observe the company from within. He worked quietly, taking notes, listening to conversations, and blending in with the rest of the staff. But not everyone welcomed him with open arms. One of the senior lawyers, Richard Wallace, had always considered himself the firm's rising star. He didn't appreciate the attention Jake was getting, especially from Sophie. "Hey, intern!" Richard called out, stopping Jake in the hallway. "Get me a coffee. Black, no sugar. And be quick about it." Jake raised an eyebrow but nodded politely. "Sure." As Jake walked away, Richard smirked and turned to his friends. "He's just another nobody trying to climb the ladder. Let's see how long he lasts." Meanwhile, Sophie noticed how some of her colleagues were treating Jake. She saw the way they dismissed him, assuming he was just another intern with no real significance. It didn't sit well with her. Later that day, as Jake returned with Richard's coffee, Sophie stepped in. "You know," she said, giving Richard a pointed look, "you could have gotten your own coffee. Jake has better things to do than play errand boy." Richard scoffed. "Relax, Sophie. It's just a coffee. Interns are supposed to do the grunt work." Jake, however, smiled at Sophie. "It's fine. I don't mind." Sophie frowned but didn't push further. Still, she made a mental note of how people treated Jake. A few days later, the firm was hosting a high-profile event, a charity gala attended by some of the most influential people in the city. Grandma Eleanor, still in her disguise, watched closely as the employees prepared for the event. She noticed how some of them treated Jake with little respect, unaware of who he really was. During the event, Richard saw an opportunity to embarrass Jake. "Hey, intern," Richard called, handing Jake a tray of drinks. "Why don't you help serve the guests? You might actually be useful for once." Sophie, who overheard, was about to intervene, but Jake simply smiled and took the tray without complaint. He moved gracefully through the crowd, handing out drinks with an air of quiet confidence. Then, something unexpected happened. An important client, Mr. Anderson, a billionaire investor, arrived at the gala. He glanced around the room, searching for a familiar face. When his eyes landed on Jake, his expression changed. "Jake! My boy!" Mr. Anderson called out, walking over and clapping Jake on the back. "It's been too long. How's your grandmother?" The entire room went silent. Richard's smirk disappeared. Sophie's eyes widened in shock. And Grandma Eleanor, standing nearby, chuckled to herself. Jake set down the tray and shook Mr. Anderson's hand warmly. "She's doing well." "It's good to see you, Mr. Anderson," Richard stammered. "Wait. You know him?" Mr. Anderson laughed. "Know him? Of course. Jake's one of the smartest young men I've ever met. His grandmother raised him well." Whispers spread through the crowd. The intern wasn't an intern at all. He was Jake Harrison, the heir to the Harrison family empire. Richard turned pale, realizing his mistake. Sophie, still processing the revelation, felt her heart race. She had defended Jake without knowing his true identity. But now, everything made sense. His humility, his quiet confidence. Grandma Eleanor, watching the scene unfold, smiled knowingly. Her plan was working perfectly. Jake turned to Richard, his expression calm. "Still want me to get you a coffee?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Richard swallowed hard. The rest of the firm looked on, wondering what would happen next. And Sophie? She couldn't help but smile. She had a feeling this was just the beginning. Richard could barely hide his embarrassment as the realization sunk in. He had been treating the heir to the firm like a mere intern. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Jake, I didn't know." Jake held up a hand. "No need to explain." His voice was calm, but there was a quiet authority beneath it that made Richard shrink back. The rest of the firm's employees were stunned. The man they had dismissed as just another intern was the future of their company. And he had seen exactly how they treated people they considered beneath them. Meanwhile, Sophie watched closely. Unlike the others, she wasn't embarrassed by how she had treated Jake, because she had treated him with kindness from the start. Grandma Eleanor stepped forward, still in her cleaner's disguise, and spoke up for the first time that evening. "It's funny, isn't it?" she said, her voice carrying across the room. "How people treat others based on what they think they know." Richard turned red, and some of the employees shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Anderson chuckled. "Well, Jake, I hope you've been enjoying your little experiment." "I must say, it was quite entertaining," Jake smiled. "It was more than just entertainment. I learned a lot about the people who work here." His gaze flickered to Richard for a brief moment, making the senior lawyer sweat. Just then, the firm's CEO, Mr. Carter, stepped onto the stage to make an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have exciting news. After years of dedicated service, I am stepping down as CEO of Harrison Company. The board has unanimously decided on my successor." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Everyone knew Jake was meant to take over eventually, but no one expected it to happen so soon. "Please welcome your new CEO, Jake Harrison." The room erupted into applause, some genuine, some forced. Jake took the stage, shaking Mr. Carter's hand before addressing the audience. "Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to step into this role. But before we talk about the future, let's address the present." His eyes swept the room, and a silence fell over the crowd. "Tonight, I witnessed how some people in this firm treat others they believe to be beneath them. That kind of behavior has no place here. This company was built on integrity, and it will continue to be built on respect." Richard swallowed hard. He wasn't the only one who had mistreated Jake, or the disguised Grandma Eleanor, but he had certainly been the most vocal. Jake continued, I believe in second chances. But I also believe in accountability. Some of you will need to reconsider how you conduct yourselves in this firm if you wish to remain a part of it. A nervous energy spread through the employees. They knew things were about to change. Sophie, meanwhile, watched Jake with admiration. He wasn't just powerful, he was fair. He wasn't interested in revenge, just in making things right. Grandma Eleanor smiled proudly. Her grandson had proven himself to be the leader she had always known he would be. After the gala, Sophie found herself in her office, still processing the night's events. She had defended Jake, not knowing who he really was. And now, he was her boss. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Hey, Jake said, stepping inside. Mind if I sit? Sophie gestured to the chair across from her. Of course, Mr. Harrison, Jake chuckled. Just Jake. Please, she smiled. All right, Jake. There was a brief silence before Jake spoke again. I wanted to thank you for standing up for me, even when you didn't know who I was. Sophie shrugged. I was just doing what was right. You didn't deserve to be treated that way. Jake studied her for a moment. That's rare. A lot of people only do what's right when it benefits them. Sophie met his gaze, and for the first time, she really let herself look at him, not as an intern, not as a CEO, but as a man. And he was unlike anyone she had ever met. Not everyone is like Richard, she said softly. Jake smiled. I know. And that's why I wanted to ask you something. Sophie raised an eyebrow. What is it? Jake hesitated for a moment, then smirked. Would you like to get a coffee? This time, on me. Sophie laughed, shaking her head. Are you asking me out, Mr. CEO? Jake leaned forward slightly, his confidence effortless. I'm asking you to have coffee with a friend. What happens after that? We'll see. Sophie thought about it for a moment, then smiled. All right, Jake. Let's see where this goes. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hope.